If you have been feeling a strange shift in the energy between you and your soulmate, if you have sensed distance mixed with intensity, silence mixed with longing, resistance mixed with awakening, then understand this clearly. Your soulmate is being pushed toward emotional maturity, and this push is not random, it is not accidental, and it is not happening without divine orchestration. Because when two souls are meant to align at a higher level, the universe will never allow one to remain emotionally stagnant while the other is evolving, and right now what may look like confusion, withdrawal, mood swings, ego battles, or emotional inconsistency is actually the pressure of growth building inside them. It is the pressure that forces a person to confront their own emotional immaturity, their avoidance patterns, their fear of vulnerability, their attachment wounds, and the habits they develop to protect themselves from past pain. And while it may feel frustrating to you, especially if you are already doing your inner work, what you are witnessing is the uncomfortable transformation of someone who can no longer escape their own emotional lessons, because when a soulmate connection is activated, it becomes a mirror that reflects everything unresolved, everything unhealed, and everything suppressed, and your presence in their life is acting as that mirror. Not because you are trying to fix them or force them, but because the bond itself triggers what they have been avoiding for years. And emotional maturity is not something that arrives gently, it comes through discomfort, through accountability, through realizing that love is not just chemistry or attraction but responsibility, consistency, communication, and emotional safety. And the more they try to run from this realization, the more the universe redirects them back toward it, sometimes through separation, sometimes through misunderstandings, sometimes through external circumstances that remove their usual distractions, because when someone is meant to grow, life begins to close every exit door that once allowed them to avoid emotional depth. And if you look closely at their behavior, you may notice signs of this internal shift, moments where they almost open up but pull back, moments where they seem softer but quickly return to defense mode, moments where guilt flickers in their eyes when they recognize how their immaturity has affected you, and these moments are evidence that something is breaking inside them, not in a destructive way, but in a reconstructive way, because emotional immaturity thrives on denial, and once denial starts to crack, growth becomes inevitable. And even if they are not consciously saying, "I need to grow," their spirit is being nudged toward that awareness, because soulmate connections are designed to elevate both individuals, not to keep one small while the other expands. And if you have been patient, if you have been setting boundaries, instead of begging, if you have chosen self-respect over chasing, then you are actually accelerating their maturity process, because nothing forces growth faster than the fear of losing someone who embodies emotional stability. And when they feel that you are no longer tolerating inconsistency, when they sense that you are no longer available for half-hearted effort, they begin to confront the possibility that their old patterns will cost them something real, and that realization is often the catalyst for emotional adulthood. Because maturity begins the moment someone understands that love requires accountability, and accountability requires humility, and humility requires facing the parts of oneself that are uncomfortable to admit, such as jealousy, insecurity, fear of abandonment, fear of commitment, or the tendency to shut down instead of communicate. And what may be happening now is that your soulmate is experiencing internal conflict between their ego and their heart, where the ego wants to maintain control, avoid vulnerability, and protect pride, but the heart wants connection, honesty, and emotional depth, and this inner battle can make them seem distant or unpredictable, but beneath that surface is a soul realizing that they cannot keep loving you in the same immature way, because the connection demands more, and sometimes the universe uses time apart to amplify this lesson. Because absence removes comfort and exposes longing, and in that silence they are forced to sit with their own thoughts, their own regrets, their own awareness of how their emotional reactions may have sabotaged something meaningful, and that awareness is painful, but pain is often the doorway to maturity, because without discomfort, there is no motivation to change, and if you are wondering why this process feels slow, it is because emotional maturity cannot be rushed. It is built layer by layer through self-reflection, through mistakes, through realizing that blaming others no longer works, and you may not see their internal evolution immediately, but shifts are happening in subtle ways, such as them recognizing patterns from their childhood that influence how they respond to conflict, or them noticing how their avoidance created distance, or them starting to feel uncomfortable with their own inconsistency, and discomfort with one's own behavior is a powerful sign of growth, because immature people rarely question themselves. But evolving people do, and your soulmate is being guided into that questioning phase, and the reason you feel the tension is because energetic cords between soulmates transmit emotional shifts, and when one is being spiritually and emotionally pressured to evolve, the other can sense it, and this is why you may feel waves of hope followed by waves of doubt, because you are intuitively picking up on their inner turbulence. But here is what you must remember: their growth is their responsibility. And your role is not to carry them through it, your role is to continue embodying the maturity you wish to receive, to maintain your boundaries, to nurture your own emotional intelligence, and to refuse to shrink yourself to accommodate their unfinished lessons, because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and allow life to teach them what you have already learned. And when someone realizes that love is not guaranteed access but a privilege that requires emotional readiness, something shifts inside them, and that shift may not come with dramatic declarations at first. It may come quietly, through them reflecting more, reacting less, listening instead of defending, apologizing instead of justifying, and choosing to communicate instead of withdraw. And these small changes are the building blocks of emotional maturity, and even if there are setbacks, even if they relapse into old habits temporarily, growth is rarely linear. And the fact that they are being pushed means that stagnation is no longer sustainable for them, because the universe will not allow a soulmate connection to remain at a surface level forever. It either evolves or it dissolves, and if this bond continues to persist despite challenges, that is a sign that evolution is the intended outcome. But evolution requires both individuals to rise, and right now your soulmate is in the rising phase, even if it looks messy, even if it feels uncertain, even if it tests your patience. Because transformation often looks like chaos before it looks like clarity, and one day you may look back at this phase and realize that what felt like distance was actually preparation, what felt like silence was reflection, what felt like resistance was fear being dismantled, and what felt like delay was divine timing aligning both of you at a level where love is not just intense but stable, not just passionate but secure, not just magnetic but mature, and until that alignment fully manifests, your task is to trust that growth cannot be forced but it can be supported through self-respect. And if this connection is truly divinely guided, emotional maturity will not be optional for them, it will be required, because soulmate love is not designed to entertain immaturity forever, it is designed to awaken it, challenge it, and ultimately transform it into something strong enough to hold the depth of the bond you share. As this process continues, what you may begin to notice is that the pressure on your soulmate intensifies in ways that even they cannot fully explain, because when someone is being pushed toward emotional maturity, life starts presenting them with repeated lessons until the lesson is understood, and if they have been avoiding vulnerability, they will find themselves craving deeper conversations. If they have been running from commitment, they will start feeling the emptiness of shallow interactions. If they have been suppressing emotions, those emotions will surface in unexpected waves. And all of this can feel overwhelming to them because emotional growth dismantles the identity they once relied on, the identity that said it is safer to detach than to depend, it is safer to stay guarded than to open up, it is safer to control than to surrender, and when that identity begins to crack, there is a temporary instability that shows up as confusion, mood shifts, or even defensiveness, but beneath that surface instability is reconstruction happening in real time. Because maturity is not about becoming perfect, it is about becoming aware, and awareness changes everything. It changes how they interpret your words, how they reflect on past conflicts, how they evaluate their own reactions, and even how they see themselves, because many emotionally immature behaviors are rooted in unconscious survival strategies formed long before you ever entered their life, and your connection has illuminated those strategies in a way no one else could. Which is why this bond feels different to them, heavier in responsibility yet deeper in meaning. And sometimes they may try to distract themselves from this realization by focusing on work, friends, or temporary pleasures, but those distractions will feel less satisfying than they once did, because once emotional awakening begins, avoidance loses its power, and this is where the real shift starts to take shape, because your soulmate begins to recognize that what they feel for you cannot be sustained through old patterns. They start to understand that love requires consistency, that trust requires transparency, and that emotional safety requires effort, and this realization can create guilt, especially if they see how their past immaturity created distance or pain, but guilt, when processed correctly, becomes motivation. It becomes the fuel that drives accountability, and accountability is one of the strongest indicators of emotional adulthood, because immature love blames while mature love reflects. Immature love deflects while mature love listens. Immature love withdraws while mature love communicates, and your soulmate is being guided toward that mature expression even if they resist it at first, and you may notice subtle differences such as them taking longer before reacting in anger, them revisiting conversations in their mind instead of immediately dismissing them feeling uncomfortable with their own defensive habits, and these internal corrections may not be visible to you right away. But they are significant because growth begins internally long before it becomes externally obvious, and during this phase it is crucial for you not to interpret their silence as indifference or their struggle as lack of love, because often the strongest feelings create the deepest fear, and if they have never been required to emotionally mature in past relationships, this connection will feel like an initiation into a new level of intimacy, and initiation is rarely comfortable. It strips away illusions. It demands honesty, it confronts ego, and it forces self-examination. And your soulmate may feel exposed, not by you attacking them, but by the mirror your energy naturally holds up, and that exposure can make them temporarily retreat, not because they do not care, but because they are recalibrating, learning how to show up in a way that aligns with the depth they feel. And you must remember that emotional maturity also includes the ability to tolerate vulnerability, to admit mistakes without collapsing into shame, to express needs without turning them into accusations, and these are skills that are learned through practice, not inherited automatically. And if your soulmate did not grow up in an environment where healthy emotional expression was modeled, this growth curve may be steeper for them, but steep does not mean impossible, it simply means the lesson is significant. And sometimes the universe amplifies the lesson by allowing temporary separation so that both of you can see the connection more clearly without the noise of reactive behavior. And in that space they may start recognizing how rare it is to find someone who challenges them to evolve instead of enabling their stagnation, and that recognition can ignite determination within them, a quiet decision to become better not out of fear alone but out of desire to sustain something meaningful. And when that decision is made internally, even if it is not yet verbalized, their energy begins to shift. Their pride softens, their listening deepens, and their actions slowly align with greater responsibility. And you may find that when communication resumes it carries a different tone, less defensive, more reflective, less reactive, more intentional, and that shift will not be accidental, it will be the result of internal battles they fought privately, battles between old habits and new awareness, between fear and courage, between ego and authenticity. And while you cannot fight those battles for them, your consistency in maintaining your own emotional standards acts as a compass that points them toward the version of themselves capable of sustaining this bond. And there may still be moments of regression because growth is rarely linear, but the overall direction will be forward if the lesson is being integrated. And one of the clearest signs of this integration will be their willingness to take responsibility without being prompted, their readiness to address issues instead of avoiding them, and their increased comfort with expressing emotions they once suppressed. And when that happens, you will feel the difference not only in words but in energy, because emotionally mature love carries stability, it carries reassurance without control, it carries passion without chaos, and it carries depth without drama. And that is the destination this process is moving toward, not a fairy tale without challenges, but a partnership where both individuals have faced their shadows and chosen growth over ego. And until that transformation fully anchors within them, your role remains the same. Remain grounded, remain self-aware, remain patient but not passive, and trust that if this soulmate bond is divinely aligned, the push toward emotional maturity will not stop until they are capable of meeting you at the level where love is not only felt but responsibly expressed. As this final phase of their transformation unfolds, what becomes clear is that emotional maturity is not just about changing behavior. It is about changing identity, because when your soulmate fully steps into emotional adulthood, they are no longer operating from the wounded version of themselves that once reacted out of fear, pride, or avoidance. They are operating from a self-aware place where love is chosen consciously rather than felt impulsively. And this shift is profound because it alters the entire dynamic of the connection. It transforms attraction into devotion, intensity into stability, and longing into commitment. And the reason this process has felt so heavy at times is because identity death is uncomfortable. It requires letting go of coping mechanisms that once felt safe. It requires admitting that some past reactions were immature, and it requires accepting that love demands responsibility, and responsibility can feel intimidating to someone who is used to emotional shortcuts. But once they cross that internal threshold, there is no returning to the old version of themselves. Because awareness makes regression harder, and even if they try briefly to slip back into detachment or ego-driven responses, it will not feel satisfying anymore, it will feel misaligned, and that misalignment is the clearest sign that maturity has taken root within them, because growth creates discomfort with old patterns, and as this new awareness stabilizes, you will begin to notice a different kind of presence from them, one that is less reactive and more intentional, less guarded and more open, less inconsistent and more reliable, and this does not mean perfection, it means progress, and progress is what sustains long-term love, because emotionally mature partners understand that conflict is not a threat but an opportunity to understand each other better. They understand that vulnerability is not weakness but strength, and they understand that commitment is not a trap but a choice made daily, and when your soulmate reaches this realization fully, their actions will reflect it without you having to demand it. Because true maturity is self-driven, it does not require constant reminders or ultimatums. It naturally expresses itself through accountability, through effort, through communication that seeks resolution instead of victory, and one of the most powerful indicators that this transformation is complete is their ability to hold space for your emotions without becoming defensive, to listen without interrupting, to apologize without conditions, and to reassure without being asked. And these shifts may seem small on the surface, but they are monumental at a soul level, because they represent someone who has confronted their own shadows and chosen growth over comfort. And what you must understand is that your role in this journey was never to force this awakening but to trigger it simply by being who you are, by embodying the emotional depth they were being called to reach. And sometimes you may not even realize how much your silence, your boundaries, your self-respect, and your refusal to chase accelerated their evolution, because nothing awakens maturity faster than the realization that love can be lost through immaturity. And when they truly feel that risk, when they understand that you will not abandon yourself to accommodate their unfinished healing, something crystallizes inside them, a decision to rise rather than retreat, and that decision is what marks the true turning point in soulmate connections. Because from that moment forward the relationship is no longer a battlefield of triggers but a training ground for conscious partnership, and while challenges will still arise as they do in any meaningful bond, the difference is that both of you will now approach those challenges as a team rather than as opponents, and that is the reward of emotional maturity, the ability to protect the connection rather than test it, to nurture it rather than threaten it, and to build it rather than destabilize it. And if at any point you doubted whether this process was worth the confusion, the waiting, or the emotional intensity, you will eventually see that the delay was preparation, the distance was refinement, and the pressure was purification, because soulmate love that survives the fire of emotional growth emerges stronger, clearer, and more aligned than before. And even if the outcome ultimately leads both of you on slightly different paths, the maturity gained will remain, shaping how each of you loves in the future. But if the path continues together, it will no longer feel like chasing potential, it will feel like standing beside someone who has consciously chosen to evolve with you, and that choice is sacred because it cannot be forced or faked. It is earned through introspection, humility, and courage, and as you move forward, remember that emotional maturity is not just their lesson but a shared standard, and the more you continue honoring your own growth, the more you reinforce the level of love you are willing to receive, and in that alignment there is peace, because you no longer need to question whether they will rise. You simply observe their actions and allow those actions to reveal their readiness, and if this connection is truly destined, the transformation you have sensed building beneath the surface will solidify into consistency, clarity, and commitment, proving that what once felt like chaos was actually the necessary path toward a love that is not only intense and spiritual but grounded, responsible, and emotionally whole. Now as this journey reaches an even deeper layer, you begin to understand that emotional maturity is not simply about them learning how to love you better, it is about them learning how to love themselves in a healthier way, because emotionally immature patterns are often rooted in self-rejection, in unprocessed wounds, in fears they never had the tools to confront, and when a soulmate connection activates, it does not just awaken romance, it awakens self-awareness, and that self-awareness can feel like standing in front of a mirror that reflects not only their strengths but also their insecurities, their jealousy, their abandonment fears, their control issues, and the ways they once confused intensity with intimacy. And when these reflections become unavoidable, the soul either chooses denial or transformation, and in this case transformation is being demanded. Not gently suggested but demanded by the very depth of what they feel for you, because the more meaningful the connection, the less tolerance there is for emotional shortcuts, and your soulmate is beginning to realize that love cannot thrive where pride dominates, that connection cannot deepen where communication is avoided, and that stability cannot grow where inconsistency is normalized, and this realization reshapes their internal world, because now every reaction they have is followed by self-evaluation. Every withdrawal is followed by reflection, every defensive moment is followed by awareness, and awareness is the seed of change, and as that seed grows, you may notice that they begin responding rather than reacting, pausing rather than escalating, expressing rather than suppressing, and these shifts might feel subtle at first but they are powerful indicators that the emotional foundation within them is being rebuilt, brick by brick, and rebuilding takes time because old structures must first be dismantled. And dismantling ego defenses can feel like losing control, which is why there may still be moments of hesitation, moments where they test the waters of vulnerability and quickly retreat, but even that retreat carries new consciousness, because unlike before they now recognize what they are doing, and recognition weakens repetition, and slowly the space between their trigger and their response becomes wider, giving maturity room to step in where impulse once ruled. And this is when you start to feel a new kind of energy between you, less chaotic, less unpredictable, more grounded, more intentional, and that grounded energy is not accidental, it is the result of internal battles they fought silently, nights of overthinking, moments of replaying conversations, realizations that they cannot blame circumstances for what requires self-improvement, and when someone reaches that stage, they begin to value emotional security over emotional drama. They begin to crave peace over power struggles, and they begin to understand that real strength lies in softness, in the courage to admit fear, in the humility to say, "I was wrong," and in the willingness to protect the connection instead of their pride, and as this maturity stabilizes within them, the dynamic between you transforms from push and pull to mutual pull, from uncertainty to clarity, from emotional turbulence to emotional teamwork, and you will notice that conversations feel safer, disagreements feel less threatening, And affection feels less conditional, because emotionally mature love does not weaponize silence, does not manipulate through distance, and does not test loyalty through inconsistency. Instead, it reassures, it communicates, it stands steady even during discomfort, and that steadiness is what you have been waiting for, not perfection but reliability, not constant intensity but consistent presence. And the most beautiful part of this transformation is that it teaches both of you that soulmate connections are not about rescuing each other from wounds but about inspiring each other to heal them, and healing requires accountability, and accountability requires courage, and your soulmate is finding that courage piece by piece, choice by choice, until one day you realize that the version of them standing before you is no longer the emotionally reactive person you once struggled to understand but someone who has consciously chosen growth, someone who understands that love is maintained through effort, protected through honesty, and strengthened through vulnerability, and when that realization fully anchors, there is a calm confidence that replaces the previous anxiety, because you no longer feel like you are waiting for them to evolve. You can see it in how they show up, how they speak, how they handle conflict, and how they prioritize the bond, and at that point the narrative shifts completely, because this is no longer a story of potential, it is a story of alignment. Not a connection surviving chaos but a partnership built on maturity, and even if the journey to reach this place felt uncertain, every delay, every lesson, every uncomfortable truth served a purpose, to refine both of you into individuals capable of sustaining the depth you share, and as you stand in this new phase you understand that emotional maturity was never a punishment, it was preparation. It was the necessary transformation that ensured the love between you would not remain fragile or impulsive but would become resilient, conscious, and enduring, and that is the ultimate reward of this process, a love that is no longer driven by fear or ego but guided by awareness, responsibility, and a mutual decision to grow together rather than apart. As this evolution reaches its most refined stage, what becomes undeniable is that emotional maturity is not a single breakthrough moment but a sustained way of being. And your soulmate is gradually stepping into that sustained awareness where love is no longer something they react to but something they consciously maintain, and this is where the true transformation becomes visible not only in their words but in their consistency, because emotionally mature love does not fluctuate based on mood, pride, or temporary fear. It remains steady even when life becomes complicated, and you will begin to sense that steadiness in how they approach you, in how they plan with you, in how they include you in their future instead of keeping you in a space of uncertainty. And this shift is profound because it signals that they are no longer relating to you from a wounded attachment style but from a grounded, self-aware position, and that grounding changes everything. It softens their tone, it deepens their listening, it stabilizes their actions, and it removes the chaos that once created confusion between you. And perhaps the most powerful sign of this maturity is their ability to self-correct without external pressure, because before growth, correction only happens after conflict. But after growth, correction happens internally before damage is done. And that internal pause, that moment where they choose patience over impulsiveness, honesty over avoidance, vulnerability over pride, is evidence that the lesson has integrated into their character, and when maturity becomes character rather than effort, the relationship enters a new dimension, one where you both feel safe expressing needs without fear of abandonment, where disagreements become opportunities for understanding rather than threats to stability, and where love feels less like a roller coaster and more like a foundation, strong enough to hold both passion and peace simultaneously. And you may look back at the earlier phases of this journey and realize that what once felt like emotional immaturity was actually unfinished healing seeking completion, and your presence triggered that completion not by force but by resonance, because soulmate connections do not allow either person to remain asleep forever. They awaken what is dormant, they challenge what is stagnant, and they demand what is authentic, and your soulmate has been walking through that awakening, sometimes resisting, sometimes surrendering, sometimes stumbling, but ultimately rising, and now the energy between you begins to reflect equality, not one person carrying emotional weight while the other avoids it, but both standing as adults in the connection, capable of taking responsibility for their feelings, their reactions, and their choices, and this equality creates balance, and balance creates longevity, because a relationship built on emotional maturity does not collapse under pressure, it adapts, it communicates, it recalibrates, and it strengthens through challenges rather than being weakened by them. And perhaps the most beautiful transformation of all is the shift from fear-based love to choice-based love, because immature love clings out of fear of loss, but mature love stays out of conscious decision. And when your soulmate chooses you from a place of clarity rather than compulsion, that choice carries depth, intention, and respect, and you feel it in the way they protect the bond, in the way they prioritize resolution over ego, in the way they show up even when it would be easier to retreat, and this is when you understand that the push toward emotional maturity was never meant to break the connection but to strengthen it, to elevate it beyond attraction and into partnership, beyond longing and into loyalty, beyond intensity and into stability, and as you both stand in this evolved space, you realize that the journey was as important as the destination, because without the discomfort there would have been no reflection, without the reflection there would have been no growth, and without the growth there would have been no sustainable love, and now what remains is a bond that feels calmer yet deeper, quieter yet stronger, less dramatic yet more fulfilling. And this is the true essence of emotional maturity within a soulmate connection, not perfection, but progress, not control but cooperation, not fear but faith, and as you move forward together, the love you share is no longer fragile or reactive, it is conscious, intentional, and resilient, built not just on feelings but on the decision to keep growing side by side. And that decision, renewed daily, is what transforms a soulmate connection from a spiritual spark into a lifelong, emotionally grounded union. And now, as this journey settles into its deepest layer of understanding, you begin to realize that emotional maturity is not simply about how your soulmate treats you, but about how they relate to reality itself. Because an emotionally mature person stops fighting what they feel and starts taking ownership of it, they stop projecting blame and start examining their own triggers, they stop expecting love to save them and start strengthening themselves so they can sustain love. And this internal shift changes the entire energetic frequency of the connection, because when someone becomes emotionally responsible, they no longer approach the relationship from scarcity or fear, they approach it from stability and intention, and that stability creates safety, and safety allows love to expand without tension. And perhaps what feels most different now is that you no longer sense resistance underneath their affection, you no longer feel that subtle wall behind their words. You no longer question whether they will pull away the moment things become vulnerable, because something inside them has anchored, something has settled, something has decided that running is no longer an option and avoidance is no longer protection, and this anchoring is powerful because it is self-chosen, not forced by you, not pressured by circumstances, but realized through their own awakening, and when maturity is self-realized it carries permanence. It is not temporary behavior modification, it is identity evolution. And identity evolution means they see themselves differently now. They see themselves as someone capable of consistency, capable of emotional depth, capable of maintaining a healthy bond without sabotaging it, and this self-perception shift is crucial because people act in alignment with who they believe they are, and when your soulmate begins to believe they are emotionally mature, their actions will naturally follow that belief, and you will notice that reassurance flows more freely. Planning feels more mutual, communication feels less like effort and more like alignment, and even during challenges there is a new steadiness, a sense that the connection is not fragile but fortified, and what once triggered panic now invites conversation. What once created distance now inspires closeness, because emotional maturity replaces reaction with reflection, and reflection leads to conscious response, and conscious response builds trust, and trust is the true foundation of soulmate unions. Not intensity, not obsession, not constant passion, but trust that both people are choosing the bond with awareness. And as this trust solidifies, the energy between you becomes calmer yet more magnetic, softer yet stronger, because love no longer feels like something that could collapse at any moment. It feels supported by two individuals who have faced their own shadows and returned with wisdom, and in this phase you also experience your own growth mirrored back to you. Because their maturity validates your patience, your boundaries, your refusal to settle for emotional inconsistency, and it shows you that standing firm in your standards did not push them away but guided them toward elevation, and this realization brings peace, because you understand that real soulmate connections are not about chasing or convincing, they are about evolving until both souls can meet at the same emotional altitude. And when that altitude is reached there is harmony, not because conflict disappears but because conflict is handled with respect, not because fear never arises but because fear is expressed honestly rather than acted out destructively. And this is the ultimate shift, the transition from reactive love to conscious love, from wounded attachment to secure partnership. And as you move forward from this point, what you carry is not just romance but reliability, not just chemistry but commitment, not just spiritual intensity but emotional grounding, and that combination is rare, it is sacred, it is earned through growth rather than granted through fate alone. And you may look back at the earlier phases of uncertainty and realize they were necessary catalysts. They were the pressure that shaped this stronger version of your soulmate, and in truth they shaped you as well, because emotional maturity within a connection is never one-sided, it is a shared ascension, and now that both of you have stepped into greater awareness, the love you build is no longer fragile or dependent on perfect circumstances, it is resilient, adaptable, and consciously nurtured. And that is where soulmate energy fulfills its highest purpose, not merely to ignite intense emotion but to inspire lasting evolution, to transform two individuals into partners who choose each other not out of fear of being alone but out of clarity, strength, and emotional wholeness. And when love reaches that level, it is no longer something that feels uncertain or unstable. it becomes a steady flame, quietly powerful, consistently warm, and strong enough to endure the seasons of life without losing its light. That as this final stretch of the journey unfolds, what you begin to witness is not just emotional maturity in isolated moments but emotional leadership emerging within your soulmate, because true growth does not stop at self-awareness, it expands into responsibility for the energy they bring into the relationship every single day. And when someone reaches this stage, they no longer wait to be corrected, they anticipate what nurtures the bond and they move toward it willingly. They become proactive instead of reactive, intentional instead of impulsive, and this is where the connection feels undeniably different, because you are no longer carrying the emotional weight alone, you are no longer the only one reflecting, adjusting, and protecting the dynamic. Now there is reciprocity, now there is balance, now there is a shared understanding that love must be tended like something valuable rather than tested like something disposable. And this balance creates a profound sense of relief within you, because the uncertainty that once lived in the background begins to dissolve, replaced by a quiet confidence that they are emotionally present, that they are invested not only in the feeling of love but in the responsibility of sustaining it. And sustaining love requires discipline, it requires choosing patience when irritation surfaces, choosing dialogue when silence would be easier, choosing reassurance when pride would rather withdraw. And your soulmate is learning to make those choices consistently. Not perfectly but consciously, and that consciousness is what defines emotional adulthood, because maturity is not the absence of emotion but the mastery of it, the ability to feel deeply without being controlled by every passing wave, the ability to experience fear without letting it sabotage connection, the ability to experience disagreement without questioning commitment. And when these capacities stabilize within them, the relationship evolves into something steady enough to handle life's unpredictability. And you begin to notice that plans feel more secure, promises feel more grounded, and words feel aligned with action. And that alignment is essential because emotional immaturity often reveals itself through inconsistency between what is said and what is done, but emotional maturity closes that gap. It ensures that intention and behavior reflect each other, and as that alignment strengthens, trust deepens naturally. Not because you are convincing yourself to believe in them but because their behavior provides evidence of growth, and evidence builds security, and security allows vulnerability to expand without fear. And this is where the connection transforms into a safe emotional space rather than an emotional gamble. And in that safety both of you can express desires, concerns, dreams, and even insecurities without worrying that honesty will push the other away, because emotional maturity creates resilience. It creates the capacity to hear difficult truths without collapsing into defensiveness, and your soulmate is stepping into that resilience now, understanding that love is not maintained through control or intensity but through steadiness and emotional integrity. And perhaps one of the most beautiful changes you will observe is their willingness to initiate repair, to recognize when something feels off and address it before distance grows, to prioritize harmony without sacrificing authenticity. And this willingness signals that they no longer see conflict as a threat to the bond but as a natural part of deep connection that can be navigated respectfully. And when both partners adopt this mindset, the relationship becomes collaborative rather than combative, supportive rather than strained, and even during stressful external circumstances there is an underlying sense of unity, because emotional maturity teaches that the problem is never each other but the challenge itself, and challenges are meant to be faced side by side, not weaponized against one another. And as you stand in this new chapter you may realize that the very qualities you once hoped they would embody are now emerging organically, not because you forced change but because growth was internally chosen, and internally chosen growth is sustainable. It does not fade when things become comfortable, it does not disappear when the initial intensity softens, it remains because it has become part of who they are, and that permanence allows you to relax into the connection in a way you could not before. Because you are no longer waiting for potential to become reality, you are witnessing reality shaped by maturity, and this witnessing brings gratitude, not only for the outcome but for the lessons that shaped it, because without the earlier tension neither of you would have reached this depth of understanding, and now the love between you feels less like a storm and more like a foundation, strong enough to build upon, calm enough to enjoy, and resilient enough to endure. And this is the ultimate evolution of a soulmate bond, not just intense emotion or spiritual chemistry but two individuals who have done the inner work required to hold something meaningful, two people who choose growth over ego, accountability over avoidance, and partnership over pride, and when that choice becomes consistent, the connection stops feeling fragile and starts feeling destined, not because it is effortless but because both souls have matured enough to protect it, nurture it, and honor it with the emotional depth it always deserved.